The painting for today's model is inspired, and I mean that quite literally. I know a person with awesome hair and wanted to attempt to paint a model's hair in the same colours. And I have been working on the perfect model for it, a punk riding a jet bike. Specifically, this is an Escher cutter, a Citadel model for the game Necromunda. The jet bike itself goes together really easily, mostly just two halves of the body with a vent on the front and back that are all keyed and so can only go in the correct way. There's some gubbins and cabling that goes around the front in 4 pieces. They're also individually keyed, but a little small and fiddly, but it's an open area so it's not so bad. There's some foot pedals that need to go on, and there's also a smoke grenade dispenser on the back, which I decided not to use as it spoils the lines. The decision was made for me as to which of the forward-facing weapons I would be using. As my sprue is second-hand, I only had a complete set of the plasma guns. So I glued in the cabling to connect the gun to the bike and added that sub-assembly. It was kind of odd twisting the cabling around to fit both connections at the same time, but the keying at both ends actually has a little bit of a shroud of sorts, and so it doesn't need to be perfect. There's a really cool blade that goes on the back behind the rider. Now the instructions say that you should put this in after putting the rider in place to lock them in place, but I'll make my own mistakes, thank you very much. The rider herself, the Escher Ganger, goes together equally as easily. The torso pieces and the legs are all keyed and they just line up correctly with all the contact points on the bike. And whilst that blade on the back of the bike does interfere, if I don't glue the legs together properly, I can snap her into place after it's painted. To make the sub-assemblies work and to ensure I had the correct alignment, I fitted the arms and handlebars and all of the other pieces at the same time, but without gluing her wrists. And I left it so that nothing would shift until it was fully set, and then I pulled that leg off to free her for painting. But just as I was setting up to paint, I had a thought about those plasma guns. I am working on, as I have mentioned far too many times, a jet bike racing game, and this model will be perfect for it. And you don't need guns for a race? And I think this model looked way cooler before I put them on, and so off they came again. For one of the other weapons, there's a blanking panel with rivets that covers some of the cable location quite nicely, but the actual weapon mounts themselves, when I cut those away, left a bit of a gap. I smoothed it out as best I could and I looked at the last pieces on my second-hand sprue. I noticed an ammo feed for one of the other weapons was present, and that could be repurposed as a sort of cover, and it suits pretty nicely. So, onwards to paint. Unlike my usual grey, I started the bike off in black, and that is so that the entire model is going to have a darker tone. But I immediately dry brushed a lighter grey over everything that's going to be metal, and that will make sense when I come back to it later on. If you remember, I mentioned my inspiration, a person who has blue and green in their hair, and I wanted the bike and the biker's clothes to act as the base colours, and so the hair would act as the accent colour. And I quickly came to the idea of using the triad of secondaries, that being orange and purple and green. There'll be a bright green in the hair, but I want the orange and purple to be very dark to emphasise the hair. The Escher gangers in the lore of Necromunda and their bikes are often painted in yellows and purples, so I can push the purple onto the ganger's clothes, no problem, and it'll fit the original setting, but pulling that yellow into an orange on the bike, well, that would be far more interesting. And I'll achieve that by using almost no orange whatsoever and barely any yellow. Did I say I wanted a muted orange? Well, what's more muted than brown? After base coating the fairing in a dark brown, I stippled on a lighter, very warm brown, and the warmness comes from just a touch of red, and that's where we start to get into what might technically be considered orange, even though it is very much in the category of brown. This stippling was only to bring in a visual texture. I'm being careful to keep the paint thin so that it doesn't clump and form a physical texture, as I want it to look like an old but well-maintained vehicle and not lumpy. I like the idea of bringing in some of my accent green onto the bike as well, and there's some little pipes around the engine that would be a great place for that. After struggling with my very thin, nasty green paint for a while, I realised it's actually not a green paint at all. It's an acid texture effect. Sometimes I don't pay enough attention when I'm buying my paints. And, well, I'm lazy, as has been well established by anyone who's watched my videos for any length of time, and so a black wash is going to pick out a lot of the physical sculpt on the model without me putting very much effort in at all. All of the panel lines and recesses are going to be nicely darkened and form a border for all of the other pieces. Circling back around to my metalwork, with the black dry brush of grey and now the black wash, all I need to do is come in and just gently pick out some of the upper surfaces with metal, a nice bright silver, and these will be the brightest reflections on the metalwork, and with the gloss brought in from the wash, that metallic effect gives a striking, oily but well maintained look, which is what I'm going for. I could easily have been a lot more subtle than this, but I was actually really liking the boldness that I brought. And that boldness of subtlety will continue with the fairing on the bike. I already have this mottled brown now, and overall very dark, especially with the wash, but with a tiny bit of red in there as well, so it's sort of technically already an orange. But now I'm going to jump all the way into a very orange paint for a, say it with me now, an edge highlight. I usually quite enjoy a very pale and subtle edge highlight, a grey or a desaturated version of the panel colour, and being very gentle to put in smaller pieces. This time, my orange edge highlight is very bright and very saturated, and I'm putting solid lines around everything. And this didn't actually do what I wanted it to do, but I really liked what it did do, and so I'm sticking with it. I had intended to bring out an overall orange look, but instead it looks like a neon orange edge on a much darker background, which is pretty cool, and it matches the striking effect of the metalwork, and so I like it. The biker herself, as I mentioned earlier with my Secondarys Triad, is largely getting purple, but I'm also going to include a fair bit of black for that goth look. I realised as I was painting a little highlight on her boots that the purple paint that I have is very glossy, which means there's two paints in this model that aren't the right type of paint, but at least this one is actually a paint. I struggle a little bit here and there with highlighting the black into grey and the purple into pink, and then I moved on to tackling her skin. I realised later on that a darker skin tone would actually fit the theme of the model very nicely, but in the moment I went with a lighter, more red skin tone to act as a contrast for the deep purple of her clothes. I was certainly not aiming for smooth blends here. She's not a fashion model, she's a ganger, a fighter. She has muscle and sinew, and so whilst painting her skin, I emphasised the scratchy lines that would lean into that effect of a badass warrior. Finally, after a few hours of building and painting, I got to the point of me painting this model, the hair. My inspiration had a darker main colour to their hair with a smaller area of extremely bright, vivid colour. And to replicate that in contrast, I'm going to need to go all of the way from black to a very saturated blue or green, with most of the hair ending up black or near black in the end, and just those vibrant spots being saturated and bright, with very quick transitions between them. But to start with, I wanted to lay out the base highlights that would lighten into those areas. So my first highlights are big splotches that cover many strands of hair, whole areas of the sculpt, and I'm going to strengthen them with the most saturated paints I have. And my blue is more saturated than my greens, so that will end up being the most prominent. I come back with some black and the thinnest lines that I can manage to separate the strands of hair from each other. And this is not just following the plastic sculpt, but adding in my own lines, as many as I can manage in the direction the hair is flowing. I realised at one point that if I add a yellow to my blue, I end up with a far more saturated green than my actual green. Go figure, that's how paints work. Unfortunately, I don't have much of this process. A lot of it was done off camera to make it easier for me to paint, and what I did do on camera, unfortunately, was out of focus. But I feel like I have achieved tonally the right effect, and thus a lot of the hues are sparkling in the right way. There's plenty of imperfections on this piece, as any artist will always look at their work in that kind of way, but for something that I threw paint at for a couple of hours for the express purpose of painting in specific colours, well, that just came out pretty nicely. So let me know if you've seen any colour or lighting effect or thematic setting recently that sent you into a rabbit hole of creating. But for now, I'm ED-SKaR, always will be, and thank you very much for watching.